Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are stepping right into a truly fascinating historical detective story. We're looking at a topic that has historically created a massive theological divide. Specifically, how we can actually reconcile the perspectives between hadith rejectors or skeptics on one side and Quran-centric thinkers on the other regarding the age of Aisha, the mother of the faithful, when she got married. It's a heavy topic, I know, but by carefully analyzing the source material, we're going to bridge this gap. We'll use logic, classical scholarship, and some deep historical context to see how these seemingly opposing viewpoints might actually perfectly align. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start off with 1, the core dilemma, look at 2, historical clues, and then calculate 3, the math of ages. After that, we'll uncover 4, linguistic truths, factor in 5, the transmission effect, and finally, examine 6, the strategic context. We're just going to objectively follow the hard data to find the truth here. All right, let's start with Section 1, the core dilemma. This is basically the inciting incident for our entire investigation. Okay, let's dive into this. On one hand, we have the traditional narrative found in highly authentic collections like Sahih al-Bukhari, 5133, which states Aisha was married at 6 and the marriage was consummated at 9. Now, these reports are widely acknowledged as authentic in their chain of narration. But, contrasting this, we have a foundational Quranic principle right from Surah An-Nissa, verse 4-6. This verse explicitly requires something called rushd, which means sound judgment, before a marriage can happen and before property can be transferred. I mean, think about it. A child of 6 or 9 simply cannot meet that kind of cognitive standard, right? So we've got a real tension here. We desperately need a reconciliation between a rigorously authenticated hadith and a definitive Quranic mandate. To solve this puzzle, we move to Section 2, historical clues. We need to look beyond just a single hadith and examine other highly authentic data from the exact same era. Let's move to and see how this builds on our historical timeline. According to Sahih al-Bukhari 3682, Aisha explicitly remembered the revelation of Surah Al-Qamar, and she recalled it from her childhood. Now, historically speaking, we know for a fact that this specific surah was revealed approximately 5 years before the Hijrah, that's the migration to Medina, which marks year 0 on the Islamic calendar. For Aisha to actively remember this event, and the verses actually being revealed, she would have to possess a certain baseline level of cognitive awareness. Based on basic human development, this implies she had to be at least 10 to 12 years old by the time the Hijrah actually took place. Which brings us right into Section 3, the math of ages. This is where classical Islamic scholarship provides us with some incredibly compelling, hard data. Take a look at the internal mathematics mapped out here for Aisha's older sister Asma. The historical record universally agrees that Asma died at the age of 100 in the year 73 AH. Now, if we just do this simple math backwards, subtracting 73 from 100 means Asma was 27 years old at the time of the Hijrah. Got it? Okay, well, Al-Dhahabi also records that Asma was exactly 10 years older than her sister Aisha. So if Asma was 27 at the Hijrah, minus 10 years, that literally means Aisha was 17 years old at the time of the Hijrah. And since her marriage was consummated a year or 2 after that migration, this places her age at marriage around 18 or 19. The math preserved within the authentic historical sources points directly to her being a young adult. Now, let's pivot our investigation to Section 4, linguistic truths. We absolutely have to understand the fascinating reality of how numbers were actually communicated in 7th century Arabia. Consider the concept of 0 for a second. It was completely unknown in 7th century Arabia. It wasn't actually introduced to the Islamic world until the famous mathematician Al-Khwarizmi brought it into use in the 9th century. So why does this matter to us? Well, because without 0, there just wasn't a precise, exact numerical culture like the one we take for granted today. Numbers were very frequently used as approximations rather than exact literal figures. Furthermore, the classical Arabic of the time lacked a specific, distinct word for a teenager encompassing the ages of 13 to 19. The word for 6 is sitta, and the word for 16 is sitta ashrata. In a culture that heavily relied on oral approximations, it was incredibly common for sitta ashrata, 16, to simply be shortened in everyday speech to sitta, just 6. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how easily the number 16 can transform over time. I mean, if a speaker uses the shorthand 6 to mean 16, their immediate audience understands the context, right? But if you remove that context and pass the number down through generations, a literal 6 becomes cemented in the historical record, fundamentally changing the entire narrative of someone's age.
And that perfectly tees up Section 5, the transmission effect. We really have to account for how these texts were preserved before they were ever written down.
Hadiths were transmitted orally for over a century before any systematic compilation began, and classical scholars vigorously questioned these oral transmissions. For example, look at this quote from Imam Malik regarding Hisham ibn Urwa, who was the primary narrator of the Hadith in his later years. Imam Malik reportedly said, "Do not narrate from Hisham, his narrations are problematic." This wasn't just arbitrary. It was specifically due to a documented decline in his memory after he relocated to Kufa. The scholars of the time were acutely aware that human memory is fallible. Think about the Chinese whispers or telephone effect. Have you ever tried to pass a message around a circle? Now imagine doing that purely orally for over 100 years. Step 1, you have oral transmission for a century or more. Step 2, narrators were widely known to focus on transmitting the meaning of a story rather than the verbatim exact words. And step 3, because of this, numbers were particularly vulnerable to paraphrasing. Add in the potential for scribal errors once things were finally written down, where a 16 could so easily be miscopied as a 6 or vice versa, and it becomes super clear how a linguistic simplification could suddenly become a recorded historical fact.
Finally, let's zoom out for Section 6, strategic context. We need to look at the macro-level situation of the Prophet's life during this exact period in history.
This era immediately followed the devastating Year of Sorrow, where the Prophet lost both his chief confidant, Khadija, and his clan chief, Abu Talib. With Abu Talib's death, the Prophet lost his tribal immunity, and persecution severely intensified. Marriages during this time were urgent political survival strategies used to rebuild clan protection. Notice the specific alliances forged here. Marrying Sauda created a vital alliance with a Medinan tribe. Marrying Aisha solidified an absolute unbreakable bond with Abu Bakr, his most vital supporter. Marrying Hafsa allied him with Omar. Classical commentators like Ibn Kathir explicitly note that these marriages were for social and political bonding, not matters of personal desire. And this strategic context is explicitly backed up by the source text itself. Surah al-Ahzab, verse 3350, specifically permits the Prophet certain marriages for these exact strategic, community-building purposes. A political alliance cemented by marriage required a partner who is actually capable of understanding and upholding that alliance, which again heavily points away from a young child and directly toward a young adult. So let's bring all of this historical detective work to its ultimate resolution in our final section, reconciling the historical record. So the crucial point is this. When we synthesize all of the source material together, an age of 15 to 19 for Aisha at the time of her marriage beautifully reconciles everything. It upholds the Quranic ethics of rushd or sound judgment. It maintains complete respect for the science of hadith, explaining that while the chain itself is authentic, the interpretation of the number was just overly literal over time. It perfectly explains the linguistic realities of a pre-zero society without a word for teen, and it matches the urgent political and mathematical timeline of the era. We don't have to just blindly reject the hadith, nor do we have to ignore the clear mandates of the Quran. This provides a wonderfully unified answer for both hadith skeptics and Quran-centric thinkers alike. I really want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. If the historical math, the linguistic realities of 7th century Arabic, and the ethical standards of Scripture all point together toward one cohesive, logical truth, isn't it time we look past surface-level literalism? By embracing the full, rich context of our sources, we uncover a history that is just so much more logical and deeply unified. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and as always, keep looking at the bigger picture.